Welcome. This part of our conversation relates to risk and return, which is a conversation where we try to measure risk and therefore estimate, given that amount of risk that we bear, how much is the right compensation to seek. So this is an ongoing conversation really. It's going to cover quite a few things, but let me just put it in perspective. Remember the diagram where I showed you where the intrinsic value comes from. So think of it this way, right? We are now talking about the denominator portion of this value calculation. Okay? So value, and as we saw in time value of money, right? Value is just basically the present value of expected cash flows, right? The numerator has the free cash flows, what you are receiving, and the denominator has the opportunity cost of capital, or the discount rate. In other words, it's a return that you should require from those future cash flows. That return is what we're going to determine through our risk and return conversation. So all of this relates to actually helping us find that WACC, that cost of capital. Okay. So we just start by asking you to look at this list and determining whether some of these things make sense. These are the yield to maturities for different debt instruments. Debt instruments issued by either governments or by companies. And you'll notice that in the list you have a series of maturities, right? And a series of issuers. And for example, here it is, a 2-year Treasury security, right? So this is the maturity, this is the issuer, and you have the yield to maturity. So compare that to, say, let's go to the other extreme, right? This is the lowest yield of the list. Now compare that to the highest yield of the list, right? What is the difference? The difference is, first of all, the maturity, right? The maturity is longer. And the intuition says that, well, for longer maturities, the risk that you bear is higher, simply because you wait more time in order for your money to be returned to you. Don't forget that, for example, for a bond, you purchase this bond and you will receive the principal value at the maturity of the instrument. So imagine that you have to wait 8 or 10 years versus waiting 2 years or 1 year or 90 days. So the length of the maturity has to have an impact on the return that you require. And the market is asking for 0.31% return for the first, while 22.4% for the last issuer. That's one thing. The other thing is the issuer itself, right? The Treasury bond is issued by the Treasury, so the U.S. government, while this bond at this point in time was issued by a company whose bonds are rated CCC. Now, just to have an understanding of what that means, corporate bonds and actually country bonds too have ratings, and those ratings can go, for example, from being the highest rating, AAA, down this list. Now, depending on who your rating agency is, these things have pluses and minuses and so on, but you don't want to get to this point because this is default. Okay. But just keep in mind that if you're AAA rated versus BB rated or versus CCC rated, which is the case in, for our example here, as you go down that list, the probability of default, so the lower, the quality of the bond, the probability of default goes high, becomes higher. So a CCC rated bond implies that you bear more risk when you buy it than if you buy a AAA rated bond. If you bear more risk, then the notion is that you should be asking for a higher compensation. Thus, the 22.4% you see here compared to the 0.31% that you see here. Okay. By the way, in this rating, scale, this is a very important separation. From here on, we have what are called investment grade bonds. Investment grade, right? The highest quality group. And here you have more speculative bonds, sometimes called junk bonds, right? They're not necessarily junk, it's just that these bonds, because they're lower, they have lower ratings, they have to offer a high return because they're making you bear high risk. These ratings are determined by companies that are hired by issuers in order to rate them and so give information to the public. This is not without debate because, of course, the issue is that you are being hired to basically rate your own customers, right? So there's a whole set of conversations regarding the rating process and when it has failed, and it has failed at times. But this is what we have to go by. So going back to our list, notice, for example, that here you have a 5-year U.S. Treasury bond that yields that the market right now is asking for 1.35% return. Compare that to a 5-year Microsoft bond. The Microsoft bond is issued by a AAA rated company, so very highly rated, right? But notice that still the yield that it has to offer is higher than the yield that the U.S. government has to offer at this point in time. These are historical. This is a snapshot of what happened a few years ago. So even the excellent companies still, notice, have to offer a higher compensation that say the same kind of maturity for the same kind of currency, but for a bond issued by a government, by a credible government. Why? Well, because the conversation is, well, a company, though, has very low risk. It always has higher risk of default than the government. If it's a credible government, it can always, make its payments. It has a control of the money machine, right? So keep that in mind. However, you see that, for example, a 10-year treasury bond, right? Notice this, versus a 10-year government bond. They're both basically the same maturity. They're both issued by governments, right? And in the same currency. But notice that, again, the 10-year treasury bond at that point in time was had to offer a yield 2.61% versus a 10-year German government bond, which was only offering 1.85%. Both are governments, but some governments at this point in time had a higher credibility from a default standpoint than others. Okay, so keep this in mind, that in fact that there seems to be a relationship between risk and return, right? The higher the risk, that is, the longer the maturity, the lower the yield, the lower the rating, the least credible the issuer, in other words, then the higher the return. The higher the risk, higher return. Risk comes with longer maturities. Risk comes with lower ratings, with perceptions that the issuer is not going to be able to pay, or concerns that the issuer is not going to be able to pay, and that higher risk is reflected in these higher returns. So there is a relationship between risk and return. All right. Talking about returns, I'd like to just make sure that we understand how returns are expressed. Typically, returns are expressed as percentage units. Okay, that's the most common, and returns can be either historical or expected. Okay, basically, a return is just the result of your investment. But I just wanted to make sure that you understand exactly how returns are measured. So let me provide you with 2 examples just to make sure that this is clear.